October 30th, 1938, just past 8 o'clock at night. CBS Radio interrupted its regular programming to announce that a strange flying machine had crashed at Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton.
We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Moments later, came the announcement that people approaching the object had been struck down by a mysterious death ray. The invasion had begun.
Rising out of the pit. They make out a small beam of light against a mirror.
Armed with their incredible war machines, these Martian invaders were destroying everything in their path. There would be no stopping this army.
Lord, they're turning into flames.
It would take the Martian invaders no longer than an hour to conquer the entire world. And the mastermind behind this devastating attack was the theatrical genius, Orson Welles.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Since the early days of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, many people have wondered about the true origin of these sightings. Could UFOs be a sign of external forces, or does their mystique have a more sociological origin? How is it that UFOs have changed over the past 50 years, from classic flying saucers to ominous black triangles? The changes in stories of alien encounters are even stronger proof of this evolution. Just a half-century ago, aliens looked more like goblins in spacesuits than small people with big bug eyes. How can we explain this change in the way they look?
In the last 50 years, there has been a noticeable evolution in UFO phenomena. In the early 1950s, you had your basic flying saucer that had a tendency to break down from time to time, like your trusty old Ford. Braver aliens would stop and ask to borrow a screwdriver to repair their ship. The next big trends were alien abductions and encounters with humanoids. Then, in the early 1990s, there were waves of triangle sightings. It seems that there has been an evolution in UFOs and aliens.
In actual fact, this evolution has a familiar ring to it, since aliens have evolved in science fiction as well.
In 1978, Bertrand Meilloust, a philosopher by trade, published a book that essentially revolutionized the way we think about UFOs, called Science-Fiction et Secours Volants, literally Science Fiction and Flying Saucers. In it, he made a connection between UFOs and science fiction that apparently no one else had thought of. He compared flying saucer stories from after 1947 with popular science fiction stories prior to 1947. He found many interesting similarities, such as saucer-shaped objects, beams of light, small aliens with big heads, and abductions. It was all there in science fiction. How do we explain such a coincidence? The most obvious answer is that people who report UFO sightings must be avid readers of science fiction, case closed. But Meilloust contended from the start that the answer is not as simple as that. He presented a number of different hypotheses to explain the phenomenon, but the similarities between the two just kept on growing over time. More recently, Michel Merget, an authority on the history of science fiction, suggested that people who see UFOs are a bit like science fiction writers. Their stories, which are at least partly fictional, are based on ideas that they have already been exposed to. They are a product of their culture.
Des récits qui étaient quand même plus ou moins artificiels. Donc tout ça était une création culturelle.
Proponents of this psychological theory were quick to adopt Michel Murger's book Alien Abduction, published in 1995, over Bertrand Meust's earlier works.
What I was trying to accomplish with that book was to put my observations down on paper. The history of UFOs began in 1947. Books on UFOs had existed for 20 years before that, which meant that American readers were already familiar with the concepts of disc-shaped crafts, flying saucers, and small pilots with big heads, small pilots who abduct people. It was all there in American science fiction magazines, so it could be said that these alien stories were all simply based on these fictional models. For example, science fiction introduced the idea of men in black, who are now a well-known phenomenon in UFO circles. They're often suspected of being aliens in disguise who visit and harass UFO witnesses. As early as 1930, a document by Fortean Edmund Hamilton described one of these beings disguised as a human going around abducting or killing people because they knew too much. You get the general idea. So you see, there are distinct correlations between American fiction of the 1920s and 30s and UFO stories reported later on. That being said, there's no way of knowing precisely how the transference occurred. It would take a highly specialized sociological study that, for all intents and purposes, would be next to impossible to conduct today.
So to what extent could aliens in science fiction have actually influenced the accounts of UFO sightings? Do people subconsciously draw on science fiction folklore to embellish their stories? Or do they really experience what they claim? Some extraordinary technological advances were made at the end of the 19th century, including the telephone, gramophone, diesel engine, X-rays, and the radio. In 1886, Jules Verne wrote Robert the Conqueror, a novel in which the hero travels the world in an amazing flying machine, a cross between a boat and a blimp. At about the same time, strange objects began to appear in the sky over the United States. It was the dawn of airships, flying machines that looked more like dirigibles than spaceships. While some people saw this coincidence as an uncanny parallel to science fiction, others saw it differently.
When discussing the influence of science fiction on UFO sightings, people will often bring up the wave of airships over the United States in 1897. During the Great Airship, as it was known, one or more objects were seen flying over the country. Some people even claim to have met the occupants. Rationalists pointed to Robert the Conqueror and other futuristic novels, as sci-fi novels were known back then, saying that they had influenced journalists to create these tall tales, which was probably true in some cases. But literature wasn't the main cause of the wave. There was just something in the air at the time. Patents were being issued for inventions that bore a striking resemblance to the strange flying machines of the day. Machines made with Victorian technology, not just nuts and bolts, but heavy-duty hardware. These were machines that should not have been able to fly at all. Still, people claim to have seen giant steel cylinders with paddle wheels flying in the skies. Very strange indeed. We need to consider the possibility that people really did see these older UFOs. This is a subject that has always been of great interest to me, because these sightings occurred before 1947. Before man had begun to fly, before the invention of any aviation technology. And I guess it's entirely possible that people found old pictures from that era and touched them up, claiming that they showed what was seen in the sky at the time. Maybe that's how we ended up with those pictures of flying cigars or hovering discs taken from unusual angles.
So were these stories made up or just a sign of the times? The debate continues. There are countless examples, starting with the so-called abduction of Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. In her account, given mostly under hypnosis, Betty Hill reported that she had undergone a pregnancy test that involved inserting a long needle into her navel. There is a scene that is practically identical in Invaders from Mars, a science fiction movie that came out in 1953, 8 years before the Hill ordeal. In addition to the pregnancy test, Invaders from Mars also depicted extraterrestrials using radio transmitter implants to control the minds of their victims. There was no mention of implants in UFO stories from the 1940s and 50s, but they became incredibly popular during the 1980s. Can we just chalk up these abduction stories to the influence of science fiction in the media? Could it be that some abductions are genuine, while others are imaginary?
I guess you could say that the issue here is whether some abductions are authentic and some are just hoaxes and delusions. We live in a world of mass culture. If we're European or Canadian, we are very influenced by American mass culture. Let's not forget that thousands of stories have been influencing people since the 1920s and 30s. Plus, there were all those sci-fi movies from the 1950s depicting alien invasions. Even American cartoons featured aliens. That's a lot of exposure to the idea of aliens. And I think that people's minds just got saturated. To put it in visual terms, it's like we're living in a big fish tank, so it seems to me that it must be difficult to distinguish between a fake abduction and a genuine one. I think that as soon as potential scenarios are presented, that's good enough for me personally.
It may not be as simple as that. While some people attach a deep significance to these connections, others see them as mere coincidences.
There is no doubt in my mind that the witnesses experienced the events as real. You see, for the most part, they're just honest people, giving their version of something they really think happened to them. They believe that their interpretation is the honest-to-God truth. Their stories are not pure fiction, although there are definite similarities between the accounts they give and some elements of science fiction. But then again, you can find pretty much everything in science fiction. What I find interesting, and what, in my opinion, theorists like Michel Murger have not been able to fully explain, is why science fiction only influences certain aspects of witness accounts. Why are descriptions of aliens always the same in every story? Why is it that the bug-eyed monsters of 1930s science fiction have caught on, but not any other space monsters? Why doesn't anyone ever see little green men? Why do aliens perform the exact same tests every time? These types of questions are fundamental, but neither school of thought has been able to answer them yet.
Curiously enough, the theory that UFOs originated in science fiction was most popular in Europe, and particularly in France. The science fiction community is a lot like the ufology community. Science fiction isn't considered total trash, but then again, it certainly isn't considered in the same league as classic literature or film. The science fiction community has the same problem gaining recognition as the ufology community.